Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the important and pretty interesting site of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. So, this was a great city in the time of the early dynastic period. It had a major ziggurat. This is actually from slightly later than the early dynastic, but early dynastic had a similar kind of ziggurat with a temple on top. A very large, complex city, right, with the central areas, including the temples. The harbor over here had boats that would sail down to the Persian Gulf and trade with people in the Persian Gulf and beyond, as we're going to see when we talk about the Indus civilization. Had a number of resources. Archaeologists who excavated there excavated some neighborhoods and houses, so we know a little bit about the life of people who lived in Ur at this time. But probably the most famous find from Ur, and some people think one of the most famous finds in archaeology, especially Mesopotamian archaeology, are the royal tombs from the early dynastic period that were found. These were excavated in the 1920s. In 1922, an archaeologist by the name of Leonard Woolley started working at Ur. In order to get down to the early dynastic periods, you can see how much he had to dig through the Tell to get down to that level. There was all sorts of later periods on top of the early dynastic, but he was very interested in that time period because it dated to the time of the Sumerians and the very early civilizations of Mesopotamia. There's an interesting connection at Ur, too, because an archaeologist was working there. His name was Max Mallowan, and a mystery writer named Agatha Christie was actually visiting the site, stayed there for a while, and Agatha Christie and this archaeologist ended up getting married. Supposedly, Agatha Christie said that all women should marry archaeologists because the older you get, the more they like you. And she based probably one of her Hercule Poirot mystery novels about this excavation, Murder in Mesopotamia, where the excavator's wife, Catherine Woolley, is probably the basis for the character who gets murdered in the novel. It's actually a very good story if you're interested. So, as they were excavating near the ziggurat in this levels of the early dynastic, Leonard Woolley found a number of graves. And it looked like it was essentially a very large cemetery. There were hundreds of graves, and most of them were pretty simple. It's a simple burial, like you could see here, these little rectangles with a few pots and things like that. But there were 16 that were very, very different. They were elaborate, they were in stone buildings, and they had a lot of wealth in them. And these, he determined, were royal burials. And one of the most important of the royal burials, the royal tombs, was found in this area, and it belonged to a queen whose name was Puabi. There's many things that are interesting about this. One is we know her name because, as you'll see, a cylinder seal was found in the chamber where she was buried that had her name on it. But not only that, while Puabi, the queen, was buried here, there were about 20 people who were buried in the chamber next to her. And obviously, they didn't die of natural circumstances at the same time. They were sacrificed or they committed suicide. There's debate about that. Many people, including Woolley, believe that this was a mass suicide. Some people believe that some of them might have been executed. These were servants, a lot of female servants, and 2 guards who accompanied Puabi into the afterlife. Leonard Woolley believes that they drank poison because he found cups next to the skeletons. And he believes that means that they probably drank from some central cauldron of poison and then died. And then people laid them out neatly and then buried all of them together. Now, what else was found? Well, some of these women servants, female servants, were found very elaborately decked out. And you can see all the gold and finery that a female servant would have worn. This is what it looked like as they were excavating it. The gold is not native to Mesopotamia. That had to be traded. So it was even more of a rare commodity because it wasn't even local. The same with this blue stone called lapis lazuli, which originally comes from Afghanistan. That had to be traded as well. Now, Puabi had an even more elaborate headdress. You can see all the gold here. And this is the cylinder seal. This is that stone that, when rolled over clay, produces these pictures. And her name is written on it. It says Lady Puabi. And not just the headdress, but covered with all sorts of precious materials and things sort of showing the everyday life of royal people in early dynastic Mesopotamia, such as this is the kind of vat that she probably would have drank beer out of, using a straw to get below the yeast, but it's a golden straw. Drinking vessels, alabaster vessels, bronze were some of the things that were found there. As well as you can see some of the wreaths that would have been found on Puabi's headdress. Lyres or harps were found. There were several of them found. This is Leonard Woolley pulling out one that was made of silver, or some that were made of, you can see, gold and lapis lazuli and inlaid wood. This is a reconstruction of the parts that did not survive well, but this is sort of probably what one of these court scenes might have looked like in the royal palace of Puabi. And remember the standard of Ur that we looked at earlier, right? That came from these royal burials, and on the standard of Ur is a depiction of one of these harps being played, just like Leonard Woolley found in the royal tombs. Now, near Puabi's tomb was found another burial chamber, and it's not clear who this was for, if it was for Puabi or another royal person, but there's 73 people here. Female servants and also soldiers that were either executed or willingly sacrificed themselves and then buried in this pit. Right? So what can we take away from all of this? What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the royals in early dynastic Mesopotamia were very, very powerful. Right? Not only did they have access to lots of wealth, and this is 1,000 years before King Tut's tomb. We're going to talk about King Tut's tomb this week as well, but this is 1,000 years older than King Tut's tomb. These kings had enormous wealth, but they also had enormous power, right? They had the power of life over death. Either they could force people to commit suicide willingly, or they could have them executed. Either way, it shows tremendous power. So you can imagine there would have been a funeral procession for Puabi through Ur. They would have gone and walked down the ramp into the large pit that was constructed. Everyone would have lined up and taken their places, right? The guards, the female servants. Puabi would be laid to rest inside of that chamber. They would have drank poison or some other means, and they would have died and then been laid out neatly, and then they would have all been buried for eternity. And obviously, people witness this. So a funeral is not just for the person who's being buried. It's also for the people who are watching the ceremony, and it's conveying a message. Now, it's interesting because we're going to see many cultures that early on have sacrificial burials for rulers or kings. And later on, these kinds of practices disappear. Some people think that these practices are important early on in the civilization as the royals are kind of cementing their power. Once things are permanent and fixed, there doesn't seem to be the need to demonstrate power in this way anymore. If you want to kind of connect in a way to the royal tombs of Ur, one fun way to do it that doesn't involve sacrificing is to play a version of a board game that they actually found in one of the royal tombs. It's called the Royal Game of War, and there's many different apps on your on the iPhone or Android or whatnot that you can play. It's a race game where you try to get your pieces around the board first. It's probably the predecessor to backgammon. I've played it many times. It's actually a very fun game. So if you kind of want to get a little taste of ancient Mesopotamia, that's one thing you could do. Okay, so the early dynastic was a time period of many city-states vying for power, fighting each other, having diplomatic relations with each other, right? And this is different in comparison to what comes next. Around 2340, you have one major king of a city in Mesopotamia, right? This is Umma. Remember, Umma was fighting Lagash for supremacy, and he actually came back and defeated that city, Lagash, but he beat a number of cities in battle, but he never really did anything more than that, which was very different compared to the person that beat Lugal-Zaggisi, Sargon. Here you can see an inscription of Sargon. He captured Lugal-Zaggisi, king of Uruk, in battle, led him in a neck stock to the gate of the temple, Enlil, basically trying to humiliate Lugal-Zaggisi. Well, how is Sargon different? Well, Sargon didn't just conquer territory. He actually created something different. He created an empire. Now, what you're seeing here is the expansion of the Roman Empire. You probably know many different empires, such as the Roman Empire, the Empire of Alexander the Great, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire. There's many empires through history. We're going to learn about the Inca Empire. We're going to learn about the Empire of China. So there are empires throughout the world, throughout time. Now, what is an empire? Well, an empire is not just based on military conquest. Almost all empires start out from the point of military conquest, conquering territory, conquering people that spoke maybe a different language than you, had a different culture than you. Right? But if you beat an enemy in battle and you take a bunch of gold and you go back home, that's not an empire. For example, the Romans, when they conquered Gaul, what's now France, Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, they didn't leave. They stayed. The Romans stayed, and they made this a Roman province. So an empire is a unification of many different states into one single political unit ruled by an emperor, where a bureaucracy, an organization is created from the top in order to run the empire efficiently. Right? And in order to do this, what usually happens, so this is the military structure of the Roman Empire. You can see the emperor appoints people loyal to the emperor in charge of different parts of the military and also as part of different provinces, right? If everyone is familiar with the Easter story and the story of Jesus, and when you read the story and you read about Pontius Pilate ruled over Judea, and he was not Jewish, he was not a Judean, he was Roman. He was from the city of Rome, and he was appointed by the emperor to run the province of Judea for the empire, right? That is, in many of these empires, you want people who are loyal to the emperor primarily, even more so than local rulers, because local people will have loyalty to the country that they came from. People from Rome who are appointed and sent to a province and are in charge of that province, their main loyalty is to run that province efficiently for the empire on behalf of the emperor. And I'm going to post a couple of videos about empires to kind of give you a chance to sort of think about empires broadly. Right? But the Roman Empire, since it's so popular in TV and movies and books, is one that's very well known, and so it's a very good comparison to use for other empires. So this is what Sargon did. Sargon not only conquered cities and city-states in Mesopotamia, but he didn't leave. He integrated them all into one political unit, one empire. There's a great myth about Sargon. This is 2300 BC, that his mother gave birth to him, placed him in a basket, sent him down the river, and where he was found by a irrigator, brought to the palace and raised in the palace. It's exactly like the story of Moses, but this is 1,000 years before Moses. Right? So very, very interesting. This is probably a bronze bust of Sargon. And what do you notice here? Right? What do you notice over here? Hopefully you remember that this is that royal hairdo. So a symbol of power that still continuing in Mesopotamian culture through the empire of Sargon. Now Sargon established a main city called Akkad, and then he conquered this part of southern Mesopotamia. And this is why it's called the Akkadian Empire, because the capital city was Akkad. According to the tablets of Sargon, he conquered from the lower sea to the upper sea, right? This whole territory of people speaking different languages, different cultures, was all integrated into one political unit. And then what he did at that point is try and run the empire efficiently. So he stated that he had 5,000 people working for him. They think that these are bureaucrats, army people, right? That he basically appointed a whole retinue of people to run the empire efficiently. And of course, like many Middle Eastern kings, he bragged about his accomplishments, right? So the Sumerians were called the black-headed people. The black-headed peoples I ruled, I governed. I destroyed mighty mountains with axes of bronze. I bolted fast the upper mountains, burst through the lower mountains. 3 times I besieged the country of the sea. Now, he appointed people in charge of different provinces, as governors of territories. He put his own people in charge because that is the most efficient way to run an empire in many cases. Put people who are loyal to you. One of these famous people that was appointed was a priestess. She was in charge of the temples at Ur and the city of Uruk. Her name was Ahenduana. She's sometimes called the daughter of Sargon. We don't know if that was a title or if she was the daughter of Sargon. But she wrote on cuneiform tablets, and many people consider her to be history's first female author. That because we have tablets that we are fairly certain she wrote. So she's the first, and there were probably other female authors at this time too, but this is the first one that we can identify as being a woman who wrote down texts and literature and things like that. Now, what else did he do to keep his empire running efficiently? Well, you might not know what this is. It's a piece of stone, and it's in the shape of a duck. Here's the duck's bill. Here's the head and the neck of the duck, and it's got an inscription on it. And what this is a weight. Not only is it a weight, it's a standardized weight. Before Sargon, every city-state had their own system of weights. And this made trade very cumbersome. If you wanted to trade between one city and the next city, you had to, basically figure out the units. How much lapis lazuli is equal to, in my units, is equal to your units of gold, right? So very cumbersome. So what he did was to make one standard unit of weights and also the calendar, and that made trade so much easier. Now, all good things come to an end, or even bad ones, I guess. But the empire of Akkad only lasted about 100 years. Why did it collapse? Well, this is one of the questions that you're going to grapple with one of the civilizations that I'm going to assign you. But sort of like the Roman Empire, some people said, well, we know that it was invaded at one point. Was it an invasion that spelled the end of the Akkadian Empire? Many people think that this was not a cause, but really more an effect of the collapse. That the collapse of the empire allowed these outside people to invade. And a lot of people think the same with Rome. After the Visigoths sacked Rome, that wasn't the end of the Roman Empire. Rome kind of hobbled along for, I think, a couple hundred years. So scientists, not that long ago, started to look at data on climate to see if that would explain why this empire collapsed, why cities were abandoned, why, according to the texts of Mesopotamia, it says that the Akkadian Empire collapsed. You've got cities where they have Akkadian pottery, and then the pottery stops, and you don't get new pottery until several hundred years after. So they started to look at ocean cores, and what they found was that 4,000 years ago, around the time of the Akkadian Empire collapse, there was a major drought in the area. And so some people think that this drought ruined the agriculture, led to a crisis, and led to people leaving highly densely packed urban places where they really couldn't live and couldn't survive and move elsewhere. And that caused the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. That's what some people believe, and that's what some of the evidence tells us. You'll see with many of the civilizations that are discussed, drought or some sort of climate change is usually proposed as one of the possible reasons to explain the collapse of that civilization. So this is the end of how far we'll get in Mesopotamia. Obviously, this is not the end of Mesopotamian civilization. Mesopotamian civilization rebounds, and you've got many, many thousands of years after this of history. But now we're going to stop, and we're going to go take a look at Mesopotamia